Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Quantum Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephan Sideroff. Very pleased to have with me today Stephan Ouaknine. He's a Canadian entrepreneur and investor known for building and scaling high impact technology companies across telecommunications and clean energy. He founded multiple successful ventures, achieving several major exits before launching Inerjys, a global clean tech growth equity fund. His work has positioned him as a prominent voice in international forums such as the Clinton Global Initiatives, the World Climate Summit, and the World Economic Forum. He's widely regarded for his vision and commitment to accelerating climate positive technologies. Welcome, leaders, and those of you who want to become a leader in your own life. As the world becomes more complex and the velocity of change keeps increasing, true leadership requires resilience, presence, vision, a dynamic ability to adjust and change, and the self-awareness to create healthy environments and cultures for your constituency. I'm Dr. Stephan Sideroff, and this is Quantum Leadership Podcast, where we go beyond conventional wisdom to explore the powerful principles of the quantum effect, and that to maximize leadership's ability to connect mind, body, and organizational success. Stephan, very nice to have you with me today.
Thank you, Stephen. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. Let's begin by telling us about your leadership path. You know, your journey to coming into this field of clean energy and your leadership approach, please.
Thank you. I always knew that I was a self-starter, an entrepreneur, kind of, a leader. Even when I was a kid, I was always a leader in summer camp, which is indicative of what kind of person I think you're going to become. And I was always an entrepreneur. Even when I was in university, I started a clothing startup that grew quite large, actually. And in between classes, I had a sample bag in my little Volkswagen GTI, and I would run to clients and then go back to class. So I always knew that I wanted to build things. And, my path towards impact and clean tech was an interesting nonlinear path. I went into tech and was a part of that kind of internet revolution and the way that we did more and more on our phones, and was working in the infrastructure in the back end of these big telecom networks, innovating and making things more efficient. And working in that deep tech part, that infra part, helped me to see, and different from like applications like that might run on your phone, the deep stuff has fewer larger players, and the technologies tend to become quite entrenched over time. In other words, it's harder to make innovations backwards compatible to many years of deep infrastructure. And so after these few exits that I had, building and going through R&D, commercializing, aligning with strategic partners, and eventually positioning for exit in that industry, after I did that 3 times, I felt that I wanted my legacy to have more to do with impact, positive impact in on the planet in ways, in areas that speak to my heart. And I'm a nature lover. I've always been a nature lover, all the way back through my childhood. I mentioned camp, but through having days up in the mountains north of Montreal where I grew up, and seeing what was happening with climate, the erraticness of climate. When we talk about global warming, it's not, climate change isn't only just about warming, it's about all kinds of effects that carbon emissions are having on this planet. And many of your viewers, I'm sure, know what those are, so I don't need to go through all of them. I saw an opportunity. I recognized, and there was a whole bunch of us from like deep telecom infrastructure who had that same worldview of few large players, a lot of government regulation, and watching how the telecom markets evolved and the deregulation, the opening up to competition, and the obvious introduction of new technologies. The more a market opens up, the more it becomes ripe for startups to bring in innovations and become disruptors. And seeing the avalanche of M&A activity that happened as a result of all of this innovation, um, it became quite obvious to many of us that the world of energy and its transition to renewable energy was going to have a lot of the same factors. It was going to have a lot of the same regulation factors. It was going to have a lot of the same difficulty of large entities, large companies to make innovations backwards compatible to old technology. A great example of this is when you look at hydroelectricity in Quebec. Quebec is known for being a leader in the world of hydro, but they're using technology from the 50s and 60s, which is damming up a river and allowing the water to flow through that dam with great force, turning a turbine, powering a generator, and feeding a grid with lots of clean energy, which isn't actually as clean as they tell you. There are actually methane emissions and all kinds of nasties and environmental impacts. So looking at how you could access energy from moving water, the kinetic energy, by using the oceans, by using the tides, by, in a very non-invasive way, placing turbines where the water is already moving and not needing to dam up rivers. That's an example of a major infrastructure switch that needs to be led by younger companies introducing innovations, and that eventually turns into M&A, and larger companies can then deploy that at larger scale. So that was my path as an entrepreneur, following my love for nature, sniffing out an opportunity to do well by doing good in the world, do well financially, and building a rather unique and interestingly structured fund around not only renewables, but all things relating to climate. It includes agricultural technology, of course, it includes food upcycling, it can include electrified transport, basically anything that brings down the carbon emissions. So I'll leave it at that.
Cool, cool. So it's kind of integrating your love for nature with how you can preserve nature, so to speak.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I also believed in the notion of not being less bad. Okay, sometimes you got to flip the narrative upside down, and it's really just about building the world of the future as we see it. And so mimicking nature, basically getting out of the way. We've gotten in the way in terms of, manufacturing processes and our over reliance on, fossil fuels. And so reinventing the way we do pretty much everything in this world is what we're all about.
So in your own development, what have been some of your biggest challenges?
Well, initially, my biggest challenge, I say that the industries get in their own way. Well, sometimes individuals get in their own way too. After three exits, I think I struggled to distinguish the difference between intention, good intention, and ego. Sometimes, and I'm not a big believer in killing the ego, as some people say in the world of spirituality. They say kill the ego. I believe that it's if it's part of the design, it's meant to be there. I just don't think it necessarily needs to be driving the bus. Maybe it should have a seat in the bus, but it doesn't have to be driving the bus all the time. In other words, not all your decisions. And when I came out of my third exit, I said, we're going to build $1 billion fund. Why? Because we need that kind of scale in order to make a dent in this problem. This is not a small problem. And, $1 billion fund, like out the gate, I would even say to reporters or anybody who's covering us, that's a starting point. In other words, we'll be much larger than that. And I built out a really big office, 20,000 square foot office for an emerging fund, a brand new fund. And I filled it with 25 people, which to me seemed small because I had hundreds of employees before. But I was running manufacturing companies with lots of products and people and teams. So, of course, I needed a lot more people. A new fund doesn't need 25 people on its payroll. So I was making the mistakes of not following the guidance that I give entrepreneurs, which is keep it lean and focus on early revenues and protect your margins and grow it, in a sustainable way. And while I was just pouring money and millions upon millions into building it out, almost like a field of dreams. If you remember that movie, if you build it, they will come. And I thought I would build this gigantic platform and they will come. What I found out was that, as celebrated as an entrepreneur may be, investors like to mitigate risk, especially institutional investors, government investors, pension funds. They're all about protecting the risk. And so, moving to a new industry, risk number one. Moving from being the operational CEO, entrepreneur in a product company to the investor, the managing partner of a private equity firm, risk factor number two. And so, everybody told us, if you were doing exactly what you did in the past, like start a telecom infrastructure company, we won't even do due diligence. We'll blindly fund you. You've demonstrated it. No question that you're an amazing entrepreneur, and you'll probably have a lot of really good guidance for your portfolio companies. But we'll be in on your second closing, or we'll be in on your second fund. And this is the chicken and egg that every entrepreneur knows oh so well, which is, but I need the first one to get to the second one. So how do you, in business school, they'll teach you about the chasm model. How do you cross the chasm from a few early adopter supporters into something that is more mainstream? That's where a lot of people fall, is into that chasm of believing that one or two or three yeses is going to turn it into a huge success. So I had to restructure the way we operated, actually stumbled upon, out of necessity, a much better model for our fund. And yeah, that's a little bit of the story of even a successful entrepreneur facing headwinds, facing challenges. And then at that point, it's, what do you do? Do you just raise the white flag and give up, or do you adapt, pivot, find a way? And that's what we did.
How did you manage that emotionally? Because it must have been a big hit that you took. Well, it sounds like it was. And it sounds like you realized you were going at least somewhere in the wrong direction. How did you manage and handle that, cope with that emotionally?
That's a really good question. And, I find that a really good entrepreneur learns to not sugarcoat or to not present rose colored glasses, to people all the time. So I won't sugarcoat. It was emotionally very difficult for me because I only knew winning. It's not to say I didn't have little losses along the way, but something like that was quite challenging to even get going was not an emotion I was familiar with. And so I had to, like, really, really dig deep into myself and understand what was at the heart of things. I don't give up for a reason. Like, I'm a very tenacious person for a reason. And when you say it was going in the wrong way, it's very important to identify what your end goal is, and to remember, if that end goal still resonates, still rings true, then it's not that you're going in the wrong direction, it's that you're going about it in the wrong way, which is a nuance but an important one.
I agree.
The end destination was correct. The delivering innovations to a risk averse industry, and that causing slower than necessary growth in sustainability and renewables. Every climate scientist jumping up and down saying it's not fast enough to avert disaster. We need to have a hockey stick of growth in this industry to cool the planet. So I knew that our end destination was righteous, was correct, was right. We just needed to make those structural changes in terms of breaking it into achievable smaller bite sizes. Instead of one large blind pool fund of $1 billion, breaking it into individual mini funds that were, purpose driven into each individual investment, and working with a set of LP investors into that particular investment, which allowed them to cherry pick and get to know us better. And the other thing was adapting a little bit, changing a little bit on the profile of investor, what type. So as much as I was having access into governments and, ministers of finance promising me we were in the next, budget, federally, provincially, or even internationally, as much as, meeting heads of state like presidents and prime ministers and royals like Prince Albert, or others, was very impressive, and it made for fantastic photo opportunities, and it looked like I had incredible access around the world. I'm a results oriented person. So if they didn't result in large investments, then I had to rethink my approach. And we work more with family offices and entrepreneurs who made their money with their own two hands and understand how things operate and the risks and the rewards. So I'll leave it at that. But yes, it was definitely a challenge, but we overcame it.
Well, thank you for sharing, what was going on inside. And a couple of things that you mentioned that I think were so important is you reframed the stumbles in a constructive way to see that, to recognize them as part of the path. And so you just helped you keep moving along those lines,
Yeah.
which is great. And also I'm hearing nimbleness. I'm hearing that you hit roadblocks and you pivoted and you, in the moment, knew to shift and take it in a different direction.
Yes, I always fancied myself as a nimble operator in everything I do. That was my playing style in tennis, for example, very nimble in my tennis ability. And I started to tap into other types of activities. Some might call them hobbies, some might call them wellness modalities that augmented this connection to self, connection to source, and this nimbleness you talk about. So one of the effects of the challenges I was facing and the misalignment, perhaps, when I talked about the ego and where I was making decisions from, it required a certain check in with myself and it was causing a certain pressure on me in my chest and in my breathing. I was feeling pressure, anxieties that I had never felt in my entire life. Because when you're young and you're a bull in a china shop, you don't have time or emotional bandwidth to consider all of these things. So you don't have time to be anxious. But when you get a little bit older and a little bit wiser and a little more introspective, you do. And I see so many people suffering with exactly that, even quite successful people. So one of the techniques that even business leaders are using in order to take themselves to the next level is breath work, holotropic breath work, which is a technique of breathing in and out with an open mouth deeply, cyclically, until it starts activating the parts of your brain that are in charge of your intuition, the pineal gland. And once that decalcified pineal gland is active and sending energy, all of the masks that you wear, the personas that you've developed over the years for different people or situations, they melt away because your CO2 levels drop by 2/3 and you are no longer able to sustain those masks. They melt away. And when you stand in front of your naked truth, it brings up emotions. And those emotions are incredibly cathartic towards the process of transmutation of trauma. And so, almost by necessity, I got into the wellness space because I use this modality, among others, yoga, meditation, dance in a way that shakes a lot of stuck energy. But the big one for me was breath work. And I even got certified as a breathwork facilitator because I believed that I needed to give this gift that helped me so much back to people. And so I entered into the realm of breathwork facilitation and generally wellness and help all types of individuals, including business leaders, including like the people that you were describing watch your podcast, individually on one-on-one or in groups or even in corporate settings, which is incredibly powerful as a tool to bond the team and increase productivity. And in festivals, I've always been the guy with the headset speaking to 1,000 or more people on a business talk. And today, I'm also that guy with that same headset, maybe a slightly different outfit, doing breathwork facilitation and helping a bunch of people with their traumas and tap into their truth, tap into what makes them happy. And I think that's incredible because if we want this world to heal, we need healed, high vibrational people operating in this world as leaders. And if this podcast is about leadership, then it's just as much about clean tech innovation. I should say it's just as much about personal vibration raising than it is about whatever you do professionally, like clean tech, or maybe it's a doctor or a lawyer. Whatever you do in this world, you can raise the vibration of how you do it, but working on yourself over and above getting a massage or going to a spa or other forms of, nervous system regulation. These techniques are somatic. They get to the heart. You feel things, very, very tangible, tingly, incredible things, and you come out of it on the other end quite healed. and able to handle stress and make those pivots and be nimble. So that's my maybe long-winded answer to how did I come about being nimble.
Great. It was a great answer because there was a lot of answers within the answer, including, how you handled a big stumble, so to speak, and how you reframed it, but also how you did your own inner work and had your own self-awareness to recognize what you needed to do, and you turned that into something positive. You turned it into something that you now share with others, and I really appreciate that. Let me ask you one last question before we close today, Stefan, and that's, say something about the culture within the companies that you run or had run, and what you try and create within those cultures.
That's a great question as well. I look for thick-skinned, tenacious leaders in those companies. So a big part of the culture is um, the tenacity to keep moving forward when things are challenging. Anybody can be your fair weather friend, but how are things, culturally in a company when the orders or the quarterly revenue forecast was delayed, or when there was an issue that you needed to fix. So as an investor, I've seen very polished CEOs with fantastic presentation come in, and they're not always the right people to lead the company. Sometimes it's the rough around the edges ones who actually are going to get the job done in the end. So I like a culture of working and playing together. I like a culture of not burning yourself out. Startups tend to have a burnout culture, and that's not fantastic in the long run. If you want to make a sustainable investment, you want people to have personal lives. You want them to be able to play and enjoy and not be 1000% focused on the job all the time, because that's going to cause burnout. So culturally, that's important. And then just kind of, you want them to be mission oriented. So we have a company that, as you know, takes food that was going to be wasted and then upcycles it into something different and sells that. That's an incredible mission. If you're mission oriented, you can get super creative about where to find the feedstock, where to find the, I mean, we started with beer pulps that were, we discovered, being thrown away as garbage, going to landfill, producing methane emissions, which is worse than coal. And then we figured out that we could take it, charge for taking it, toast it, grind it, create a flour base, and create cookies and bars, and from there build all kinds of other products. That kind of thinking led us to, well, what about other pulps? What about a gluten-free product, using oat milk pulps? Then we started thinking, well, what about coffee? So a lot of coffee in this world, right? A lot of companies like Starbucks are using the beans inside that they roast. But what happens to the chaff? What happens to the shells? What happens to the antioxidants and the flavor profiles and the nutrients that are in those? Garbage. So much garbage that doesn't need to be garbage. And obviously the really obvious stuff, like all the stuff a grocery store would throw away because it's blemished, but it's still usable, and on and on and on. So we have, this culture of defying the status quo. Another example is in the world of tidal hydro. I talked about ocean energy. Well, it was a kind of a given in that industry. There were a few large players, and they were building tidal turbines like they build gigantic wind turbines, which is to say, a monolithic design. And we found a German company that had the very clever idea of building out a modular design of smaller turbines on what we call an array, which goes in the ocean. That is so much more cost efficient and also easier on OPEX, because when there's a problem with one of the turbines, you can float it up in a hydraulic to the sea level, you can replace it with another one, and it's back operating for a half an hour. Those other designs, the monolithic ones at the base of the ocean, when they're not working, you're looking at 6 months of the thing being out of the water and not operational, very expensive to fix. So all of these innovations, and I could go on and on because we have them across the entire portfolio, they are a reflection of the cultures that we've created in the company to be creative, to tap into your inner child. I talked about having fun. Well, when you when you really start to have fun together, you can be playful the way a child is. And you know what I love about being in connection with your own inner child is that your inner child, your child didn't see the limitations. Your child only saw what was possible, only saw what was fun, didn't see all the reasons why something would not work. And I find that as we get older and as we get embroiled into corporate cultures, we become more about mitigating risk, covering ourselves, protecting our political capital within the company, and wanting to make sure that we don't ruffle too many feathers. And that's about as far away from your inner child as you could get. And so stay playful.
Wonderful advice. And what I'm hearing is that this is the way you live your life, and you have successfully, number one, chosen people that fit that model, and then have conveyed that playfulness and an approach to creativity and innovation, basically making your approach the approach of the people within your company. So kudos to you for doing that. And, I wish you great success. And
Thank you. I will add one point because you asked about my leadership style at the beginning,
yeah,
and you just said that I invite this type of corporate culture, which is a reflection of my own style. I want to also bring one last point. True leadership is not about telling people what to do. It's about lifting them up and letting them be the best versions of themselves. And so, again, with that ego present, but sitting not in the driver's seat, but somewhere in the middle of the bus, you will true leadership is about letting them shine, creating an environment, a safe space for them to thrive in their own styles. So, I've learned something over the years that I want to pass on to your viewers, which is I used to think as a younger entrepreneur that I had to be disruptive, I had to be a shit disturber, and I really believed that anybody who goes with the flow is a follower. And so I was defining myself, Stephen, in opposition to things. I was an antagonist. And one day around 40 years old, I'm 51 now, one day around 40, I kind of tapped into a different energy, which is you can go with the flow. You can be in flow state, as they call it, but you can direct the flow. You can be a leader in directing the flow, but not define yourself in opposition to anything, more in terms of this is where I think we should be going, and let's all row in that same direction and inspire one another to be the best versions of who we are. So the people in my ecosystem in our companies know that it's a safe space for them to be the youest you, I like to say. And that doesn't mean that they have to be a reflection of me. I can inspire them and they can take lessons. And some of my former employees have become entrepreneurs and sold companies for lots of money, and they gave me some credit, which was very hard. It was very sweet and beautiful for me to receive that feedback, that I inspired them as entrepreneurs, but they went off and did it in their own way. So that's something I wanted to close on.
absolutely. And these are all really great points that I hope our listeners take and run with, because I think they all lead to greater success and greater leadership. So thank you, Stefan, very much. I appreciate your time today, and good luck. And you've made some really important contributions here. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, everybody, for joining me on this Quantum Leadership podcast. I hope today's conversation has inspired you to think bigger, lead more authentically, and take steps toward meaningful change. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with others and make sure you subscribe and go to my website, drstephensideroff.com. Thank you again.